Have you ever wondered what truly matters when everything around you seems to be falling apart? In this emotional story, we follow Ashley, a woman battling not only a devastating illness but also the heartbreaking distance from her own family. Discover how she finds strength and redemption in the darkest moments of her life. Get ready for a journey of love, loss, and resilience that will touch your heart. Ashley stepped into her sleek, high-rise office in downtown Chicago, her heels tapping lightly on the marble floor. At 45, she had achieved what many only dreamed of, head of a major firm, revered for her sharp mind and determination. But the controlled environment of work sharply contrasted the disarray of her personal life. Her marriage to Donald felt distant, mechanical, like they were moving through life on autopilot. Andrew, their teenage son, had drifted into his own world, leaving Ashley feeling like an outsider in her own home. At work, she was unstoppable, fueled by deadlines, high-stakes decisions, and her reputation as a woman who could handle anything. But for the past few weeks, a series of headaches had begun to disrupt her tightly controlled schedule. They started out mild, easily dismissed as stress, but quickly escalated in intensity, sometimes leaving her disoriented. Ashley, ever focused on the next task, brushed it off, convincing herself that it was just another symptom of the stress she carried. Yet, the headaches were becoming harder to ignore. As the days turned into weeks, the pain intensified, creeping into her thoughts during meetings and presentations. At night, the throbbing in her head would wake her abruptly, leaving her unable to return to sleep. She stood in front of her office mirror one morning, noticing how tired and worn she looked, but shook it off. "Just another challenge to overcome," she muttered, pushing down the rising worry. But deep inside, Ashley feared that this was something far more serious than she was willing to admit. Over lunch with her closest friend, Susan, Ashley casually mentioned the headaches that had been plaguing her for weeks. "It's probably just stress," she said, trying to wave off any real concern. But Susan wasn't convinced. With a serious look, she leaned in and said, "Ashley, sometimes our bodies are screaming for attention, and we don't listen until it's too late." Those words lingered with Ashley, more than she cared to admit. Although she quickly changed the subject, the comment planted a seed of doubt that she couldn't shake. That night, as Ashley lay in bed, her mind replayed Susan's warning. Could her headaches be a sign of something more serious? She stared at the ceiling, trying to push the thought away. "I'm just overworked," she whispered to herself, hoping to silence the growing unease. But the reality of her worsening symptoms gnawed at the back of her mind, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work and routine, Susan's words echoed, "Our bodies scream for attention." After weeks of ignoring the pain, Ashley finally caved and made an appointment with her doctor. She entered the clinic expecting to hear that it was nothing more than stress or perhaps migraines, something easily managed. But after a series of tests, her doctor requested she return for further scans. Sitting in the sterile exam room, Ashley tried to keep her composure, but the unease grew with every passing minute. When the doctor returned with a solemn look, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Ashley, we found a mass in your brain," the doctor said softly, his eyes full of sympathy. Her heart raced as she struggled to process the words. "A mass? In my brain?" she thought, her mind spinning. The doctor explained that it was likely a brain tumor, and they needed to conduct a biopsy to confirm whether it was cancerous. Everything after that was a blur. She nodded along to his words, but her thoughts were already miles away, grappling with the terrifying possibility that her life was about to change forever. The next few days were agonizing as she awaited the results. She went through the motions at work, attending meetings and answering emails, but her mind was elsewhere. At home, she tried to act normal around Donald and Andrew, not wanting to alarm them. Yet, the growing tension inside her was impossible to ignore. She found herself retreating more and more, spending hours alone in her office or lying awake at night, her mind swirling with fear. Each day brought her closer to an answer, but the waiting felt unbearable. Finally, the call came. Her doctor's voice was calm but serious. "Ashley, the biopsy confirmed it, you have brain cancer." The words hit her like a freight train, knocking the air out of her lungs. She sat in silence, gripping the phone, unable to respond. The diagnosis was more than she could handle. The control she prided herself on, the strength she always relied upon, felt like it was slipping through her fingers. For the first time in years, Ashley felt completely powerless. That evening, she sat alone in her living room, staring at the darkened windows. The world outside continued moving, but hers had come to a standstill. She thought about Donald and Andrew, how she would tell them, how they would react. But more than that, she thought about her own life, everything she had built, all the effort she had put into her career, her success. And now, none of it seemed to matter. The cancer had invaded not only her body but also every aspect of her life. Ashley sat in her office, staring blankly at her computer screen. The reality of her diagnosis was beginning to sink in, and she was faced with the unbearable question: how would she tell her family? She and Donald barely spoke about anything meaningful anymore, and Andrew, wrapped up in his teenage world, wouldn't understand the gravity of it. A part of her wanted to keep the news to herself, to avoid burdening them with the weight of her illness. But deep down, she knew that wasn't an option. They had to know. In the following days, the pressure of her secret became overwhelming. Every time she sat down with Donald for dinner or caught a glimpse of Andrew rushing off to his room, the urge to tell them swelled inside her. Yet, the words never seemed to come. How do you tell the people you love that your life might be cut short? One night, lying in bed with Donald next to her, she realized she couldn't wait any longer. The time had come, and even though she was terrified of their reactions, they deserved to know the truth. With a deep breath, Ashley gathered her courage and called Donald and Andrew into the living room. She felt her heart pounding in her chest as they sat down, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. "There's something I need to tell you," she began, her voice shaky. Donald looked up from his phone, finally sensing the seriousness of the moment, while Andrew, his face buried in a game, barely glanced up. But as Ashley began to explain, their expressions changed: confusion, then shock, then disbelief. "I have brain cancer," she said softly, her voice almost breaking. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Donald blinked, as if trying to process what he had just heard, while Andrew's mouth hung open, unable to form words. "What do you mean, cancer?" Andrew finally muttered, his voice full of fear. Donald, ever pragmatic, leaned forward and began asking questions, trying to make sense of the situation. But his tone was clinical, detached, as if he was speaking to a colleague rather than his wife. That distance between them never felt so vast. Ashley explained the situation as best she could, but with every word, the emotional chasm in the room seemed to widen. Donald was already discussing treatment options, barely acknowledging the fear in her eyes, while Andrew, still struggling to grasp the news, stood up abruptly and walked out of the room. The door to his bedroom slammed shut, leaving Ashley sitting alone with Donald, who continued speaking in low, calculated tones. She knew he meant well, but in that moment, all she wanted was for someone to hold her, to tell her it would be okay. Despite the painful reactions, Ashley felt a small sense of relief. The secret was out, and now they knew. But the momentary comfort was quickly overshadowed by the growing realization that her family was falling apart, and she was powerless to stop it. Donald's distant demeanor, Andrew's withdrawal, it all hit her harder than she expected. As the days passed, the strain of her illness began to reveal the cracks that had long existed in her family, cracks that no amount of pragmatism could mend. As the chemotherapy treatments began, Ashley found herself alone more often than not. Donald, though present physically, remained emotionally removed, diving into research and work to avoid confronting the harsh reality. Andrew retreated further into his own world, barely speaking to her at all. and though Ashley knew they were all struggling in their own ways, the loneliness was unbearable. The very people she thought would support her were slipping away just when she needed them most. As Ashley's treatment progressed, it wasn't Donald or Andrew who became her greatest support, but her sister, Abby. Abby had always been there, in the background of Ashley's life, quietly offering her love and patience. When Abby heard about the diagnosis, she showed up at Ashley's doorstep without hesitation, ready to help in any way she could. It was Abby who accompanied Ashley to her chemotherapy sessions, sitting by her side, holding her hand during the worst of it. Unlike Donald, Abby's presence was warm, comforting, and without judgment. Abby wasn't just there for the medical appointments. She became Ashley's emotional anchor, the person she could finally open up to about her fears, her pain, and the overwhelming sense of loss she was feeling. In those quiet moments, when Ashley felt the weight of everything crashing down, Abby would simply listen, offering words of encouragement when needed but mostly just being there. Their relationship, once distant and polite, blossomed into something profound, a bond Ashley had never shared with anyone, not even Donald. As the weeks passed, Ashley began to rely more and more on her sister, while Donald and Andrew continued to drift further away. It wasn't something she had anticipated, this reconnection with Abby, but it became her lifeline. The simple act of having someone who truly cared, who was present, made all the difference. Abby wasn't trying to fix things or offer solutions like Donald did, she was just there, a constant presence in Ashley's now uncertain world. In a way, Ashley found solace in her sister's company, even as her body weakened. Together, they shared moments that reminded Ashley of what truly mattered, the small, quiet joys that had once been overshadowed by her relentless drive for success. Abby would bring Ashley her favorite tea, they'd watch old movies together, and laugh about childhood memories. Those moments of normalcy became Ashley's escape from the harsh reality of her illness, a reminder that she was still alive, still capable of experiencing happiness, even in the midst of so much uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, Ashley felt a sense of peace. Her relationship with Abby became the one steady thing in her life, even as everything else seemed to be crumbling around her. She knew that no matter what happened, she had her sister by her side, and that, in itself, was enough to keep her going. As Ashley's treatments continued, Abby suggested they create a bucket list of small, achievable goals, little things to bring joy into Ashley's life during such a difficult time. At first, Ashley resisted the idea. "What's the point?" she asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion. But Abby, with her usual patience, convinced her that it wasn't about grand gestures, just simple pleasures. "Let's take it one day at a time," Abby said with a smile, handing Ashley a notepad to start jotting down ideas. They started small, a walk through the city's botanical gardens, a day at the lake, and trying new restaurants. These outings became moments of escape for Ashley, where the burden of her illness seemed lighter, if only for a few hours. Walking through the gardens, Ashley found herself admiring the vibrant colors of the flowers, something she hadn't slowed down to appreciate in years. "I forgot how beautiful this place is," she admitted, as Abby nodded beside her, quietly happy to see her sister finding joy in the little things again. One weekend, Abby surprised Ashley with tickets to a local theater production, something they used to enjoy together in their younger years. Despite feeling tired from her treatments, Ashley agreed to go, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of normalcy. Sitting in the theater, laughing at the actors' antics, Ashley could almost forget about the cancer. It was as if the world outside had paused, and for those few hours, she was just Ashley, not Ashley with cancer, but simply herself. Their bucket list wasn't about big adventures, it was about savoring the small, fleeting moments of joy. A sunset at the beach, a picnic in the park, things Ashley would have once brushed off as insignificant now carried deeper meaning. With Abby by her side, these simple experiences became a way for her to reconnect with life. "I never realized how much I needed this," Ashley confessed one afternoon as they sat watching the sun dip below the horizon. I'm grateful for every little thing now." In those moments of laughter and peace, Ashley found herself thinking less about the future and more about the present. For the first time in years, she wasn't obsessing over work or the next big project. Instead, she was fully in the moment, grateful for the time she had left and the sister who was helping her rediscover what truly mattered. It was a bittersweet realization, but one that brought her a sense of calm in the midst of the chaos. Things took a turn when Ashley went in for her next set of scans. She and Abby sat together in the sterile hospital waiting room, making light conversation to distract themselves from the looming reality of what the doctor might say. When the doctor finally called them in, Ashley felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The doctor's face was serious as he delivered the news: the tumor hadn't responded well to the treatment. In fact, it was growing more aggressively than they had anticipated. "We need to talk about other options," he said quietly, his words hanging heavy in the air. Ashley felt the ground fall out from under her. She had known the possibility existed, but hearing the confirmation shattered the fragile hope she had been holding on to. Abby reached out and took her hand, but for once, Ashley didn't have the strength to muster any positivity. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor explained the next steps: more aggressive treatments, clinical trials, or even palliative care. The reality was crushing. Ashley's mind raced, filled with fear and questions. Was it worth continuing to fight if the chances of success were slipping away? In the days following the appointment, Ashley struggled to process the news. She had been trying so hard to focus on the small joys, to find meaning in the moments she had left, but now, it all seemed to crumble. The reality of her mortality hit her with full force. She had thought she had more time, that the treatments might buy her a few more years, but now, she wasn't sure. Sitting at home with Abby, she voiced her fears for the first time. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she admitted, tears filling her eyes. Abby, as always, listened without judgment, but the weight of the moment was palpable. As she wrestled with her thoughts, Ashley began to question everything. Should she keep fighting, subjecting herself to more grueling treatments with no guarantee of success? Or should she focus on the quality of the time she had left? These were decisions she had never imagined making, and the burden of them was overwhelming. In her darkest moments, she found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering if all the success, the accolades, the endless hours at work had been worth it. What had she really gained, and what was she about to lose? The cancer was no longer just in her body, it was in her mind, consuming her thoughts, her hopes, her dreams. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized, someone worn down, fragile, uncertain. The battle she thought she could win now seemed more daunting than ever. And yet, despite the despair, there was a small part of her that wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. As Ashley's health deteriorated, the strain on her family became more evident. Donald, who had once shown some semblance of support, started to distance himself. He came home later from work, offering weak excuses about meetings and projects, but Ashley knew better. The weight of her illness was too much for him to bear, and rather than face it head-on, he chose to escape. He busied himself with distractions, anything to avoid confronting the reality of his wife's worsening condition. It broke Ashley's heart, but she was too exhausted to fight for his attention anymore. Andrew, too, seemed to withdraw further into his own world. While Ashley tried to reach out to him, offering moments of connection, his response was always brief, almost as if he didn't know how to deal with the enormity of what was happening. He avoided being at home, staying out late with friends, and when he was there, he was locked away in his room. The house that had once been filled with routine and the sounds of family now felt unbearably empty, with everyone retreating to their corners, unwilling or unable to face the storm together. Abby was the only one who remained constant, always by Ashley's side, but even she began to notice the widening rift. One evening, Abby confronted Donald about his absence. "You can't just disappear when things get tough," she said, her voice tight with frustration. Donald, looking weary, shrugged. "I'm doing what I can," he replied coldly. Abby's face hardened, knowing that wasn't true. Donald wasn't doing what he could, he was running away. And as much as Ashley tried to hide it, she felt the sting of his abandonment more than ever. The emotional distance between Ashley and her family grew with each passing day, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. There were times when she would sit alone in the house, wondering how everything had come to this. She had fought so hard in her life to build something meaningful, yet now, in her time of greatest need, the people she relied on the most were slipping away. The cancer was not only ravaging her body but was also tearing apart the fragile connections within her family. In the quiet moments, when the pain was too much to bear and the loneliness too profound, Ashley would think about how different things might have been. If she had spent less time at work, if she had nurtured her relationships more, maybe, just maybe, her family wouldn't feel so far away. But those thoughts only deepened the ache in her chest. Her family was her greatest source of pain, and in the end, it wasn't the cancer that hurt the most, but the feeling of being abandoned by the ones she loved. Ashley returned home from yet another grueling chemotherapy session, her body aching with exhaustion. She longed for the comfort of her family, for some small sign that they were still with her, emotionally if not physically. As she walked through the front door, she was met with an eerie silence. The house, normally filled with the hum of everyday life, felt colder than ever. She called out for Donald and Andrew, but there was no response. The quiet was unsettling, making her heart race with a sense of foreboding. She moved through the house, her steps slow and heavy, until she reached the living room. There, on the coffee table, she found a note, folded neatly. With trembling hands, she picked it up and read the brief message scrawled in Donald's handwriting: "We need some time apart. Andrew and I are staying at my mother's." The words blurred in front of her eyes as she tried to process what she was reading. Time apart? Now? In her most vulnerable moment, they had left her. The pain of the cancer paled in comparison to the pain of their betrayal. Ashley stood frozen in the middle of the room, the note still clutched in her hand. She had feared this moment, had sensed the growing distance, but never had she imagined that Donald and Andrew would actually leave her. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back, refusing to let the overwhelming sadness consume her. But the reality was inescapable. The people she had loved, the family she had sacrificed so much for, had abandoned her when she needed them most. She dropped the note onto the table and sank onto the couch, feeling utterly defeated. The house, once a place of refuge, now felt like a prison. She was alone, left to face the devastating truth that her family had chosen to walk away. The weight of it all was crushing, and for the first time, Ashley wasn't sure if she had the strength to keep going. Everything she had feared had come true, and in that moment, it felt like the fight had been drained out of her completely. The emptiness around her mirrored the emptiness inside. Ashley sat in silence, the shadows of the room closing in, wondering how things had come to this. The cancer was one battle, but this, the abandonment, the loneliness, was something she hadn't prepared for. Her body was weak, her spirit broken, and for the first time, Ashley allowed herself to cry for everything she had lost. In the days following Donald and Andrew's departure, Ashley was left alone to confront the suffocating silence of her home. Every corner of the house reminded her of the life she once had, a life now shattered by illness and abandonment. She spent hours reflecting on the choices she had made, the long hours at work, the emotional distance from her family, and the weight of regret became unbearable. She had always believed that success would fill the void, but now, it felt meaningless. Even though Abby visited daily, providing comfort and love, the absence of Donald and Andrew loomed large, leaving Ashley feeling abandoned at her most vulnerable. At night, when the house was quiet, Ashley lay in bed, consumed by thoughts of what she had lost. Regrets filled her mind, the moments with her family she had missed, the connections she hadn't nurtured. Abby's words of encouragement were her only solace, but even they couldn't erase the overwhelming sadness that had taken root. The pain of her illness was heavy, but the pain of being left behind by the people she loved hurt more. In her darkest moments, she wondered if she had the strength to keep going, but Abby's presence kept her from falling completely into despair, reminding her that there was still something worth fighting for. After days of reflection and heartbreak, Ashley made a decision. She couldn't change what had already happened, but she could control what came next. With Abby's support, she decided to stop living in the shadow of her illness and the pain of her family's abandonment. She would focus on the time she had left, making it as meaningful as possible. "I'm tired of feeling like a victim," she told Abby one afternoon, her voice resolute. For the first time in weeks, there was a spark of determination in her eyes. She wasn't going to let her illness define her remaining days. One of the first steps Ashley took was selling her company. It was a decision that surprised everyone, but to her, it felt liberating. The company that had once been the center of her world now felt like a weight she no longer needed to carry. She wanted to focus on herself, on her relationships, and on the things that truly mattered. The money from the sale would ensure her financial security, but more importantly, it would give her the freedom to live her life without the constant pressure of work. It was a fresh start. Next, she made peace with the idea that Donald and Andrew might never come back in the way she hoped. It wasn't easy, but Abby helped her see that she couldn't force people to be what they weren't ready to be. Instead of clinging to the hope of their return, Ashley decided to move forward, focusing on the people who were still in her life. Abby had proven to be the one constant, and Ashley found comfort in knowing that her sister's love and support were unwavering. It was a painful realization, but it brought her a sense of closure. With her mind set on making the most of the time she had left, Ashley began to create new routines. She spent her days surrounded by nature, visiting parks and gardens with Abby, appreciating the beauty in the world that she had once been too busy to notice. Each moment felt like a gift, and Ashley found herself cherishing the simple things: a cup of tea, a sunset, a quiet conversation. For the first time in years, she was living in the present, no longer chasing the next big achievement but instead savoring the moments that mattered most. As the weeks passed, Ashley felt a sense of peace settle over her. The cancer was still there, and the future was uncertain, but she no longer feared what was to come. She had made her decisions, found strength in her bond with Abby, and reclaimed control over her life. The looming shadow of death no longer consumed her thoughts. Instead, she focused on the love and light she still had, determined to live each day fully, with grace and courage. A few weeks later, something unexpected happened. Donald and Andrew returned. It was an awkward reunion, the tension thick in the air as they stood in the doorway of the house they had once left behind. Donald's demeanor had shifted, and he appeared more attentive, even remorseful. He apologized for leaving, explaining that he hadn't known how to handle the situation. Andrew, quieter than usual, muttered something about being scared and not understanding the gravity of what was happening at the time. Ashley listened, her heart conflicted. While part of her wanted to welcome them back with open arms, another part couldn't forget the pain of their abandonment. Donald, in particular, seemed eager to make amends, suggesting that they rebuild their family. He spoke of starting fresh, of coming together during this difficult time. But as the conversation continued, Ashley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Donald began talking about practical matters, specifically about her will and the company she had sold. His focus on finances raised red flags, and Abby, who had been sitting quietly by Ashley's side, exchanged a knowing glance with her sister. It became clear that Donald's intentions weren't as pure as they seemed. When Donald suggested that he help manage the money from the sale of Ashley's company, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His sudden reappearance wasn't driven by love or regret, it was driven by greed. Abby, always protective of Ashley, was the first to speak up. "Why are you really here, Donald?" she asked bluntly, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Donald's face paled, and he stumbled over his words, trying to deny any ulterior motives, but the damage had been done. Ashley's heart sank as she realized the truth. Though the revelation hurt deeply, Ashley remained calm. She had been through too much to let this break her. "I've already made my decisions," she said softly, her voice steady. "And they don't involve you." Donald and Andrew sat in stunned silence as Ashley explained that she had made arrangements for her sister, Abby, to be the primary beneficiary of her estate. It was Abby who had been there for her, who had supported her through the darkest days, and it was only right that she be the one to receive Ashley's final gift. There would be no room for greed in her legacy. Donald's face hardened, and though Andrew looked regretful, it was clear they both understood the finality of Ashley's decision. They left soon after, and as the door closed behind them, Ashley felt a sense of peace. She had finally taken control of her life and her legacy, ensuring that it would go to the person who truly deserved it. Abby sat beside her, gently squeezing her hand, and for the first time in a long while, Ashley felt truly free. Ashley passed away quietly one night, slipping from life while asleep beside her sister, Abby. It was a peaceful end, after weeks of suffering, but the sadness that followed was immense. Abby had stayed with her every night, holding her hand, offering comfort as the illness drained her strength. That night had been no different. Abby had whispered soft reassurances, telling Ashley that she loved her and that everything would be okay. As Ashley drifted off to sleep, her breathing slow and steady, Abby never imagined that it would be the last time she'd hear her sister's voice. In the early hours of the morning, Abby woke to find Ashley's hand cold in her own. She knew immediately what had happened, but the reality of it struck her with a crushing force. Her sister, the person who had fought so hard, who had faced the end with courage and grace, was gone. Abby's heart broke as she sat there, staring at Ashley's peaceful face, knowing she had taken her last breath in the stillness of the night. Tears flowed freely as Abby clutched her sister's hand, whispering her name through sobs, wishing for just one more moment together. The house felt eerily quiet in the hours that followed. Abby stayed by Ashley's side, unable to leave, caught in the bittersweet reality of the moment. She was grateful that Ashley had found peace, that her suffering was over, but the emptiness that filled the room was unbearable. The bond they had shared during those final months had been something Abby would cherish forever, but losing her now felt like an unimaginable void. "You're free now," Abby whispered, her voice shaking, as she kissed Ashley's forehead one last time. When the rest of the family arrived, Abby stood strong, though her heart was shattered. Donald and Andrew reacted in their own ways, Donald silent, his face set in an unreadable expression, and Andrew pale and shaken, tears brimming in his eyes. Abby, despite her grief, knew that Ashley's final moments had been as peaceful as they could have been. She had been surrounded by love, by the quiet presence of the one person who had never left her side. In that, there was a small sense of comfort, though the pain of the loss was still raw. Ashley's death was a reminder of the fragility of life and the strength it takes to love and let go. For Abby, watching her sister slip away had been both heartbreaking and profound. She had been there to witness the end, to say goodbye in a way that felt true to their bond. And though her grief was overwhelming, Abby knew she had done everything she could for her sister, loved her, cared for her, and stayed with her until the very end. The day of Ashley's will reading arrived, and the air was thick with anticipation and tension. Abby sat at the head of the table, holding the envelope containing Ashley's final wishes. Donald and Andrew were seated across from her, both of them quiet, their expressions unreadable. Abby took a deep breath, remembering her promise to Ashley, to carry out her wishes exactly as she had asked. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope and began to read the carefully penned words of her late sister. Ashley's voice echoed through the room as Abby read aloud. In her will, Ashley left her estate primarily to Abby, in recognition of the unwavering support and love she had shown during her final months. To my sister, who was there when I needed her the most, Ashley had written, "I leave everything, not because of money or wealth, but because of the bond we shared, and because she stood by me until the very end." Donald and Andrew remained silent, their faces betraying a mix of shock and disbelief as Abby continued. Ashley's message to Andrew was one of forgiveness and hope. "You are still young," the letter read, "and you have time to understand the value of love and family. I forgive you for the distance, and I hope one day you'll see what truly matters." But when Abby read the portion addressed to Donald, the tone shifted. Ashley had been clear: "Donald, I wish you peace, but my decision stands. You were absent when I needed you most, and I cannot leave my legacy in hands that were not there to carry the weight of my struggle. My estate will be handled by Abby, in full." The words hung in the air like a final, irrevocable truth, one that neither Donald nor Andrew could ignore. Donald's face hardened, his mouth set in a tight line as the realization of his exclusion hit him fully. Andrew, on the other hand, looked devastated. He sat in stunned silence, his eyes downcast, reflecting on his mother's words. The weight of his regret was palpable, the pain of having lost the opportunity to truly be there for her evident in his expression. "I should have been there," he muttered softly, as if speaking to himself. Abby glanced at him, her heart heavy for her nephew, knowing that the lesson Ashley had hoped to impart would linger with him long after this day. Donald stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a harsh scrape. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, storming out of the room, unwilling to accept what had just transpired. Andrew remained seated, his gaze fixed on the table, too overwhelmed by guilt and regret to follow his father. Abby gently folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, her heart aching for both of them. She had fulfilled Ashley's final wish, but the emotional toll was undeniable. As Abby walked out of the room, leaving Andrew to his thoughts, she knew that Ashley's legacy would live on, not just in the wealth she had left behind, but in the lessons about love, loyalty, and the consequences of neglect. The final image was of Abby walking away, her heart filled with both sorrow and peace, knowing that she had honored her sister's last request, even if it had broken hearts in the process.